What happens when America's most beloved late-night host decides he's had enough of royal drama and chooses to ask the questions everyone's been thinking? Tonight, we're diving into the most uncomfortable interview in Tonight Show history, where Jimmy Fallon abandoned his usual softball approach and delivered a masterclass in journalistic confrontation that left Prince Harry visibly shaken and scrambling for answers. This wasn't your typical celebrity appearance filled with games and laughs. This was raw, unfiltered television that had viewers glued to their screens as one of the most controversial royals faced questions he clearly wasn't prepared for. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what unfolded next will shock you. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because you're not going to want to miss how this plays out. Trust me, this gets intense. The Tonight Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, but something felt different tonight. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his iconic desk, his trademark grin noticeably subdued as he shuffled through his note cards one final time. The audience, packed with tourists and die-hard fans, had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prince Harry," Jimmy announced, his voice carrying less enthusiasm than usual. The royal emerged from backstage, waving to the crowd with that practiced smile royals perfect from birth. He looked relaxed, confident even, settling into the guest chair like he owned the place. "Harry, great to have you back on the show," Jimmy began, but his usual warmth seemed forced. "Last time you were here, things were, let's say, different with your family situation." Prince Harry's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, Jimmy, that's one way to put it. But I'm here to talk about my new projects, the foundation work, positive things." "Right, positive things." Jimmy nodded slowly, leaning forward slightly. "But here's what I don't understand. And maybe you can help our audience understand too. You've spent years talking about wanting privacy, wanting to protect your family, wanting to step away from the royal spotlight." The audience sensed the shift in tone. This wasn't the Jimmy they knew, the one who played silly games and asked about favorite pizza toppings. "Yes, that's correct," Harry replied cautiously. "So help me out here," Jimmy continued, his voice taking on an edge that caught everyone off guard. "You wanted privacy, but you wrote a book sharing intimate family details. You wanted to step away from the spotlight, but you're here, on my show, which is broadcast to millions of people. You wanted to protect your family, but you've spent the last few years publicly discussing private conversations with your father and brother." The studio fell unnaturally quiet. Prince Harry's media-trained composure began to crack around the edges. "Jimmy, I think you're mischaracterizing what I've been trying to do," Harry started, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Am I, though?" Jimmy pressed, pulling out a copy of Harry's memoir. "Because I've read your book, cover to cover, and I've got to say, for someone who values privacy, you sure shared a lot of private moments. Page 247. You describe a conversation with your father where he allegedly said there wasn't enough money to support Meghan. That's pretty specific for someone concerned about privacy." "Fro." Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his royal training warring with his obvious irritation. "Those stories needed to be told to provide context for why we made the decisions we made." "Context," Jimmy repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Okay, let's talk about context. Your grandmother, the Queen, spent 70 years serving her country without ever once publicly criticizing family members or sharing private conversations. Your grandfather, Prince Philip, served in World War II and never once wrote a tell-all about the royal family. But you couldn't make it 4 years without writing a book that reads like a royal gossip magazine." The audience was dead silent now, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the Tonight Show they'd paid to see. "That's not fair, Jimmy," Harry replied, his calm facade beginning to slip. "You don't understand the pressures we were under. The racism Meghan faced, the lack of support from the institution. I don't understand pressure?" Jimmy's voice rose slightly. "Harry, I'm a comedian from New York who works in one of the most cutthroat industries in the world. I understand pressure, but when I have problems with my family, I don't write a book about it and sell it to the highest bidder." Prince Harry's jaw tightened visibly. "This isn't about money, Jimmy. This was about setting the record straight. Setting the record straight? Jimmy mused, flipping through the book's pages. Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you threw your entire family under the bus to make a quick profit. Your father, who you admit loves you. Your brother, who you grew up with. Your stepmother, who you acknowledge tried to include you. All of them got the treatment in your book. You're being incredibly unfair right now, Harry said, his voice growing sharper. You don't know what it's like to be born into that family, to have every move scrutinized, to watch your wife being destroyed by the British press while your family does nothing to help. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, studying the prince with an expression the audience had never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost predatory. You know what, Harry? You're right. I don't know what it's like to be born into the royal family. But I do know what it's like to have family problems. I know what it's like to disagree with people you love, and I know what loyalty looks like. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Audience members were glancing at each other uncertainly, wondering if they should laugh, clap, or just sit in stunned silence. And here's what I can't figure out, Jimmy continued relentlessly. You talk about loyalty constantly, about how the royal family wasn't loyal to you and Meghan, but what about your loyalty to them? What about the loyalty you owed to your grandmother in her final years? What about the loyalty you owed to your father, who, according to your own book, tried to support you? Prince Harry's media training was failing him now. His face flushed red, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair. Jimmy, I think you're way out of line here. Am I? Jimmy shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, you're a grown man who threw a very public tantrum when you didn't get your way. And now, you're trying to rewrite history to make yourself look like the victim. The studio audience was completely silent now, caught between shock and fascination. This was car crash television at its finest, and nobody could look away. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Prince Harry finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You know what? Jimmy, I came here tonight thinking we were going to have a normal conversation, but clearly you've decided to ambush me instead. Ambush you? Jimmy's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Harry, these are questions that millions of people have been asking since your book came out. If asking you to explain your own actions is an ambush, then maybe that says more about your actions than it does about my questions. The prince leaned forward aggressively. You're twisting everything I've said and done. You're making it sound like I just woke up one day and decided to destroy my family for fun. Then explain it to me. Jimmy challenged, spreading his hands wide. Make me understand, because right now, it looks like you had everything. You were beloved by the British public, you had a beautiful wife, a new baby, a role in one of the world's most respected institutions, and you threw it all away because, what? Someone asked questions about your son's skin color? Harry's face went white, then red. That someone was a member of my family, Jimmy. A member of my family expressed concerns about how dark my son's skin might be before he was even born. How is that acceptable? It's not acceptable if that's what happened. Jimmy replied evenly. But here's what I find interesting. You and Meghan made this explosive allegation in your interview. Then when pressed for details, you both got very vague very quickly. Who said it? When did they say it? What were the exact words? You know, the kind of details that might actually allow people to judge whether this was genuine racism or just an awkward comment taken out of context. We protected that person's identity, Harry insisted. Protected them? Jimmy's voice dripped with skepticism. Harry, you named names for everything else. You told us exactly what your father said about money, exactly what William said about Meghan, exactly what Catherine did that made Meghan cry. But for the most serious allegation of all, suddenly you become protective of privacy? That's awfully convenient. Prince Harry was visibly struggling now, his composure completely shattered. You don't understand the situation we were in. The press was destroying Meghan daily, and the palace was doing nothing to protect her. The palace was doing nothing? Jimmy pulled out his phone. Because I've got some receipts here, Harry. Your own palace staff issued multiple statements defending Meghan during her time as a working royal. They responded to false stories. They issued clarifications when needed. But apparently that wasn't enough for you. It wasn't nearly enough, Harry snapped. They would issue a statement for other family members over the smallest things. But when it came to Meghan, suddenly they couldn't interfere with press freedom. Okay, let's talk about that, Jimmy said, his tone becoming dangerously calm. You want to know why I think the palace staff might have been hesitant to constantly defend Meghan? Because every time they did, you or she would do another interview or make another statement that contradicted their defense. They couldn't keep up with the changing narrative. The audience was completely transfixed now, watching what was essentially a professional assassination playing out in real time. That's not true, Harry protested weakly. Isn't it? Jimmy continued relentlessly. First, Meghan was portrayed as this innocent newcomer who just wanted to serve. Then suddenly she was this independent feminist who wasn't going to follow outdated protocols. Then she was the victim who was never taught how things worked. Which version is the truth, Harry? Because your story keeps changing depending on what serves your narrative best. Prince Harry stood up suddenly, then sat back down just as quickly, realizing how bad it would look to storm off on live television. Jimmy, you're being incredibly hostile right now. This isn't journalism. This is character assassination. Character assassination? Jimmy's voice rose dangerously. Harry, I'm using your own words from your own book and your own interviews. If that feels like character assassination, maybe you should ask yourself why. The royal was sweating now, his carefully styled hair beginning to look disheveled as he ran his hands through it repeatedly. You're taking everything out of context. Then give me the context, Jimmy demanded. Explain to me why it was okay for you to share intimate details about your brother's marriage, about your father's finances, about private family conversations, about your stepmother's media strategy. Explain to me why that was justified. Because they weren't protecting us. Harry exploded, his voice cracking with emotion. They were protecting themselves and throwing us to the wolves. We had no choice but to tell our side of the story. You had no choice? Jimmy's voice was incredulous. Harry, you could have left quietly. You could have moved to America, started your new life, and maintained your dignity and your family relationships. Nobody forced you to give that interview. Nobody forced you to write that book. Nobody forced you to spend years publicly attacking the people who raised you. They attacked us first. Harry shot back desperately. Did they, though? Jimmy leaned forward intently. Because I've been following this story closely, and what I saw was a family trying to accommodate you and Meghan as much as they could within the constraints of a 1,000-year-old institution. What I saw was your grandmother, in her 90s, trying to find a way to let you have the life you wanted while still maintaining the stability of the monarchy. What I saw was your father continuing to fund your lifestyle even after you'd publicly humiliated him. Prince Harry's hands were shaking now. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Jimmy's voice was cold as ice. Because here's what I think happened, Harry. I think you met Meghan, fell in love, which is great. I think she came into the royal family with certain expectations about how much freedom and influence she would have. When she realized that being a working royal meant following protocols and serving the institution rather than using it as a platform for her own agenda, she got frustrated. And instead of trying to work within the system or leaving quietly, you both decided to burn the whole thing down on your way out. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the cameramen seemed frozen in place. That's not what happened, Harry whispered, but his voice lacked any conviction. Isn't it? Jimmy pressed. Because everything you've done since leaving suggests that's exactly what happened. You left the royal family because you wanted privacy. Then you signed deals with Netflix and Spotify worth hundreds of millions. You wanted to escape the media scrutiny. Then you did interview after interview after interview. You wanted to protect your family's reputation. Then you spent years publicly airing your grievances against them. Prince Harry looked like he was about to cry or throw up, possibly both. The confident, media-savvy royal, who had walked onto the stage 20 minutes earlier, was gone, replaced by a man who looked cornered and desperate. Jimmy, I think we should probably wrap this up, Harry said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Oh, we're just getting started," Jimmy replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because we haven't even talked about the really interesting stuff yet. We haven't talked about the timing of your book release, right after your grandmother died. We haven't talked about your wife's convenient memory lapses during that first interview. And we definitely haven't talked about what you're really doing here in America." Prince Harry's face went ashen at Jimmy's words. The mention of his grandmother's death and the timing of his book release hit him like a physical blow. "Don't you dare bring my grandmother into this," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. "Why not?" Jimmy asked coldly. "You did. You released a book full of private family moments and criticisms just months after she passed away. A woman who spent her entire life protecting the institution you were actively trying to damage. Tell me, Harry, what do you think she would have thought about your book?" "She would have understood," Harry said. But his voice cracked on the words. "Would she?" Jimmy's tone was relentless. "Because from everything I've read about Queen Elizabeth, she believed in duty, service, and keeping family matters private. Your book goes against everything she stood for, and you released it when she couldn't defend herself or your family anymore." The audience was watching what could only be described as a public breakdown. Prince Harry's hands were visibly trembling, and sweat was beading on his forehead under the studio lights. "You're being cruel, Jimmy," Harry whispered. "I'm being honest," Jimmy replied sharply. "And speaking of honesty, let's talk about Meghan's convenient memory problems during your big interview. She couldn't remember if she'd looked up information about the royal family before dating you. She couldn't remember basic facts about royal protocol that any Google search would have revealed. But she could remember every slight, every perceived insult, every moment where she felt unsupported. That's awfully selective memory, don't you think?" "She was under enormous pressure," Harry defended weakly. "We're all under pressure, Harry," Jimmy shot back. "The difference is, most of us don't use our pressure as an excuse to destroy our families on international television. And let's be honest about what that interview really was. It wasn't about seeking understanding or healing. It was about revenge." "That's not true," Harry protested, but his voice was barely audible now. "Isn't it?" Jimmy leaned back in his chair, studying the broken man across from him. "You waited until your grandfather was dying, and your grandmother was in her final years. You waited until they were at their most vulnerable, and then you struck. You knew they couldn't fight back without looking petty. You knew the timing would maximize the damage while minimizing their ability to respond." Prince Harry put his head in his hands. "Please stop," he mumbled. "Stop telling the truth?" Jimmy's voice was merciless. "Because that's all I'm doing, Harry. I'm saying what everyone else has been thinking but was too polite to say. You weaponized your mental health struggles, your mother's death, your military service, all of it, to make yourselves untouchable critics of your own family. My mental health struggles are real," Harry said, looking up with tears in his eyes. "I'm sure they are," Jimmy acknowledged. "And I'm sorry you've suffered. But having mental health issues doesn't give you the right to destroy other people, especially the people who love you. Your father has mental health struggles too, Harry. Your brother does. Your stepmother does. We all do. But most of us don't use our pain as a weapon against our families." The studio was dead silent except for the sound of Harry's ragged breathing. This was beyond uncomfortable television now. This was watching a man completely fall apart in real time. "And let's talk about what you're really doing here in America," Jimmy continued, showing no mercy. "You came here talking about building a new life, about charity work, about making a difference. But what have you actually done? You've started a podcast that nobody listens to, made a Netflix documentary about yourselves, and spent most of your time giving interviews about how badly your family treated you. That's not building a new life, Harry. That's being a professional victim." "We're doing important work," Harry said desperately. "Are you?" Jimmy challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, your most successful venture has been selling your family secrets. Your charity work gets minimal attention, your media projects are failing, but every time you trash your family, you get headlines and sympathy. You've built an entire brand around being the wronged prince, and you're never going to give that up because it's the only thing that makes you relevant. Prince Harry was openly crying now, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of Jimmy's words hit him. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of the world's most famous men completely broke down on live television. "You want to know what the saddest part is?" Jimmy's voice softened slightly, but his words remained cutting. "You had everything, Harry. You had a family who loved you despite your flaws. You had a role that mattered, work that made a difference. You had the respect and admiration of millions of people around the world. And you threw it all away because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention anymore." "That's not why," Harry sobbed. "Isn't it?" Jimmy pressed. "Because when William got married and had children, suddenly, you weren't the spare anymore. You were just another royal. When your father became king, your role became even smaller. And instead of accepting that and finding meaning in supporting the institution, you decided to tear it down because you couldn't be the star." The broken prince could barely speak through his tears. "I just wanted to be free." "Free to do what, Harry?" Jimmy asked with devastating precision. "Free to make millions of dollars trading on your royal connections, while simultaneously attacking the institution that gave you those connections? Free to live in a mansion in California while lecturing people about inequality? Free to demand privacy while selling your most intimate family moments to the highest bidder? That's not freedom, Harry. That's having your cake and eating it too." Jimmy paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would be his final blow. "You know what real freedom would have been? Walking away quietly, living your life with dignity, maintaining your relationships with your family while building something meaningful in America. But that would have required actual courage, actual principles, and actual work. It was much easier to play the victim and cash in on the drama." Prince Harry sat there, completely destroyed, unable to form a coherent response. The confident royal who had entered the studio was gone, replaced by a broken man confronted with truths he'd been avoiding for years. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. "That's our show tonight, folks. Sometimes the most important conversations are the most uncomfortable ones." The audience remained silent as the credits rolled, unsure whether to applaud or simply process what they'd just witnessed. History had been made on The Tonight Show, and nobody in that studio would ever forget it. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't just an interview. It was a reckoning. And for Prince Harry, there would be no coming back from what had just happened. What did you think of this brutal takedown? Subscribe now and let me know in the comments. Do you think Jimmy Fallon went too far? Or was this the reality check Prince Harry needed to hear?